David Carter never imagined his Monday morning would begin with handcuffs. As the newly appointed Director of Homeland Security, he had spent years breaking barriers, proving himself, and earning a position of immense responsibility. But in just 15 minutes at Bradley International Airport, all of that vanished. To the TSA officers standing before him, he was not the nation's top security official. He was just another black man in a suit. A suspicious individual in their eyes. What followed was more than a case of mistaken identity. It was a harsh lesson about privilege, power, and the prejudices that still divide America. And the officers who detained him had no idea they were about to make a mistake that would change airport security forever. "Sir, I need you to step aside." The words cut through the air like a blade, sharp and final. David Carter paused, his carry-on bag slung over one shoulder, his government-issued phone in hand. He had just texted his wife Naomi, letting her know his flight was still on time, a miracle considering the thunderstorms delaying flights across the East Coast. "Sir, now," the voice repeated, firmer this time. David looked up. The TSA officer, a broad-shouldered man with a name badge reading Coleman, stared at him with an intensity that made David's stomach tighten. He recognized that look. He had seen it too many times before. "Is there a problem?" David asked, keeping his voice steady. Coleman's hand drifted to his hip. "Step aside for additional screening." Around them, the morning rush moved effortlessly. Business travelers clutching coffee cups, families juggling sleepy children, college students lost in their headphones. None of them were being stopped. David's jaw clenched. "May I ask why I've been selected?" The answer was already obvious. "Random screening, sir," Coleman replied, his eyes flicking briefly to David's expensive watch before returning to his face. "Standard procedure." Those two words rang hollow as David was escorted into a small, windowless room off the main concourse. He had been through this before, many times, but he had hoped that after being appointed Director of Homeland Security, those days were behind him. Inside the room, a second officer was waiting. Younger, red-haired, freckles dusting his nose, making him look barely old enough to vote. His name badge read Murphy. "Empty your pockets," Murphy instructed. David exhaled slowly and complied. Wallet, phone, keys, and his government ID landing on the table with a soft thud. Murphy picked up the ID, squinting at it. Then he looked back at David, suspicion flashing across his face. "Department of Homeland Security?" "That's right," David replied. Murphy's eyes narrowed. "What's your position there?" David took a slow breath. "I'm the director." A beat of silence followed, then a sharp, humorless laugh. Coleman smirked. "Right, and I'm the President of the United States." He turned to Murphy. "Check his bag." David's patience wore thin. "Officer Coleman," he said, voice controlled but firm, "you can verify my identity with a simple phone call." "We'll get to that," Coleman replied, arms crossed. "For now, we need to check your bag. We received information about a suspicious individual matching your description." And there it was. Not random screening. Not standard procedure. Someone had reported a black man in a suit as suspicious. David already knew the answer, but he asked anyway. What exactly was suspicious about this individual? Coleman's jaw tightened. "We're not at liberty to discuss the details of the report." His eyes shifted away, betraying his discomfort. "Standard procedure," he repeated. Murphy went through David's carry-on with cold precision, removing his laptop, a change of clothes, a toiletry bag. "Sir, what's the purpose of your travel today?" "I'm flying to Denver for a Homeland Security conference," David replied. "I'm delivering the keynote address tomorrow morning." Murphy glanced at Coleman, who remained stone-faced. "Look," David said, keeping his voice even, "I understand that you're doing your job, but I am the Director of Homeland Security, and I will be late for my flight if this continues. Call my office, they'll confirm my identity." Coleman folded his arms. "Sir, making false claims about government positions is a federal offense." David stared at him, incredulous. "I'm not making false claims. Call the number on my ID. Or better yet, Google me. David Carter, Director of Homeland Security. I was appointed 3 months ago." "Sir, please remain calm," Murphy interjected, using that particular tone law enforcement adopted when they anticipated escalation. "I am calm," David said, his voice steady, "but I am also late for a flight that I need to be on, and I'm trying to help you avoid making a serious mistake." Coleman stepped closer. "Sir, You'll need to come with us for further questioning. David's eyes flashed. On what grounds? Coleman didn't blink. Suspicious behavior, he said, and false impersonation of a federal official. A familiar heat rose in David's chest, a mix of anger and humiliation. Not since before he earned his law degree. Not since before he joined the FBI. Not since before he became one of the youngest deputy directors in history. Not since before he was appointed to lead Homeland Security. I want to speak to your supervisor, David said, his voice quiet but firm. In due time, Coleman replied. First, we need to confirm your identity. David gestured to the ID sitting on the table. My identity is right there. IDs can be faked, Coleman shot back. David closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself. When he opened them, his decision was made. I'm not answering any more questions without legal representation, he said. I'm invoking my right to remain silent. I am not resisting, but I am not consenting to further search or questioning. Coleman's face hardened. Sir, he said, pulling out his handcuffs, turn around and place your hands behind your back. David's stomach dropped. They were arresting him. This is absurd, but he knew. Resisting would only make things worse. He turned. Cold metal snapped shut around his wrists. As they escorted him through the terminal, David was acutely aware of the stares. Hundreds of travelers watched a black man in handcuffs being led away by TSA officers. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others stared, curious about what crime he must have committed. David kept his head high, his face neutral. Even his humiliation burned through him. Because this wasn't just about him. This was about every black traveler who had been subjected to the same injustice. But unlike them, David had the power to fight back. And when this was over, he would. Because this fight was far from finished. David Carter couldn't believe it had gone this far. You're arresting me? Detaining you, Officer Coleman corrected, pending identity verification. This is absurd, David said, but he knew resistance would only make things worse. The cold metal of handcuffs snapped around his wrists. As they led him through the terminal, David felt the weight of every stare. Hundreds of travelers watched, some glancing away uncomfortable. Others stared openly, their expressions unreadable. To them, he wasn't the director of Homeland Security. He was just another black man in handcuffs. David kept his head high, his face neutral, even as humiliation burned through him. They brought him to a security office near baggage claim. Behind the desk sat a woman in her 50s, silver-streaked black hair framing a face marked by years of experience. She looked up, frowning. What's this? She asked. Coleman didn't hesitate. Suspicious individual, potential false impersonation of a federal official. Claims to be the director of Homeland Security. The woman's nameplate read Chief Linda Park. She turned to David, then back to Coleman. Did you verify his identity? Coleman shifted. He has an ID, but we haven't confirmed its authenticity yet. Park sighed, then focused on David. Sir, what's your name? Finally, someone with common sense. David Carter, he said. A brief, almost imperceptible widening of Park's eyes. Then, firm authority in her voice. Uncuff him, immediately. Coleman stiffened. But Chief? Now Officer Coleman, Park said, her voice like steel. Coleman hesitated, his face flushed with either anger or embarrassment, maybe both. But after a moment he complied, removing the cuffs. David rubbed his wrists, the skin red and raw, then nodded toward the plastic evidence bag Officer Murphy held, his belongings still inside. Give Mr. Carter his things, Park ordered. Murphy obeyed. David retrieved his ID and handed it to Park. She examined it, her expression tightening. Then her eyes met his. Director Carter. A pause. I can't express how deeply sorry I am for this. This is completely unacceptable. David nodded. Yes, it is. Park gestured to a seat, and David straightened his suit jacket before sitting down. May I ask, he said, what happened from your perspective? Park leaned forward, hands clasped on the desk. I'd like to know that myself, she said. Walk me through it. David's voice remained calm, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. I was selected for random screening, despite having TSA pre-check clearance and my government credentials clearly displayed. Park's jaw tightened. When I identified myself as the director of Homeland Security, David continued, Officer Coleman accused me of making false claims and chose to detain me, rather than make a simple phone call to verify my identity. Park's gaze snapped to Coleman. If looks could melt steel, he would have been a puddle on the floor. Officer Coleman, she said, step outside. You too, Murphy. Murphy looked uneasy. Coleman, however, looked furious. "Chief, I was just following. Now." They left. The door shut behind them. For the first time since this nightmare began, David felt like he was talking to someone who actually understood the gravity of what had just happened. "Director Carter," Park said. "I can't begin to tell you how sorry I am. This should never have happened." "No," David agreed, "it shouldn't have, but it did." His eyes locked onto hers. "And it happens to black travelers every day." Park's face darkened. "You're absolutely right." David leaned forward. "If you're serious about fixing this, here's what I need. First, I want a full report of the incident, including the original reason I was flagged for additional screening. I want to know who reported me as suspicious and why. Second, I want Officer Coleman suspended, pending a full investigation into his conduct. Third, I want a comprehensive review of your random screening procedures, with specific attention to racial disparities." Park nodded slowly, taking in every word. "Of course," she said. "I'll make sure all of that happens." David's voice remained steady. "Good, because when I return from Denver, I'll be launching a full departmental investigation into racial profiling at this airport." Park's expression turned solemn. "This isn't just about me, Chief Park," David said. "This is about a systemic problem that affects thousands of travelers who don't have the power to fight back." Park exhaled slowly, nodding again. "I understand, and for what it's worth," she said, "I agree with you. We can do better. We should do better." David glanced at his watch. "Now I've missed my flight," he said. "I need to be on the next one to Denver, and I don't want any further issues." "You won't have any," Park promised. "I'll personally escort you to your gate and make sure you're on the next flight, and expect a formal apology from the head of airport security before the day is over." As they walked back through the terminal, David felt the weight of what had just happened settling on his shoulders. The humiliation was fading, replaced by something else, a familiar determination. This was why he had taken this job. This was why he had spent decades building his career. So that when moments like this happened, moments of injustice, of bias, of systemic failure, he would be in a position to do something about it. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Naomi. "Everything okay? You missed your check-in." David exhaled, then typed back, "Delayed. Tell you about it later. Love you." Then he straightened his tie, lifted his chin, and continued walking. Hundreds of travelers went about their business, unaware that they had just witnessed a pivotal moment in one man's lifelong fight against injustice, a fight that was far from over. Naomi Carter knew something was wrong the moment David walked through the front door that evening. 20 years of marriage had taught her how to read him like a book. He tried to compose himself, but she saw right through it. "What happened?" she asked, taking his coat. David set his briefcase down. "The usual," he said. "Random screening at Bradley International." Naomi's eyes narrowed. "How random?" David gave a dry, humorless laugh. "About as random as the sun rising in the east." He followed her into the kitchen, where the aroma of her famous jerk chicken filled the air. But the moment he said the next words, her entire demeanor changed. "It went further this time," he said. "They detained me. Handcuffs and everything." Naomi froze. "They what?" She set down the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir the rice and peas. Her Jamaican accent, usually soft and warm, sharpened with anger. "David," she said, "tell me everything. Now." David Carter recounted the entire incident as Naomi finished preparing dinner. From the moment he was pulled aside, to the handcuffs, to his meeting with Chief Park, he laid it all out. By the time he was done, they were seated at the dining table, but Naomi had barely touched her food. "After everything you've accomplished," she said, her voice tight with anger, "after all the barriers you've broken, this is still what it comes down to, the color of your skin?" David reached across the table, taking her hand. "It's why I took this job, Naomi," he said softly. "To change things. Not just for us, for Caleb and Maya, for everyone who looks like us." Naomi squeezed his hand. "I know," she murmured, "but sometimes I wonder, does anything really change? My father faced the same discrimination you do. Will our children face it too, no matter what they achieve?" David's jaw tightened. "Not if I can help it," he said. His voice was firm, determined. "I've already set things in motion. There's going to be an investigation. Officer Coleman will be suspended pending review. But that's just the beginning. I want a complete overhaul of airport screening procedures at every major airport in the country. Naomi nodded, but her eyes were sad. You know they'll fight you on this, she warned. The system doesn't like to admit its flaws. David gave a small, knowing smile. Then it's a good thing I'm stubborn? Naomi finally cracked a smile, shaking her head. Nearly as stubborn as my wife. Nearly, she corrected, smirking, but not quite. Just then, the front door opened, followed by the sound of their daughter's voice. Mom, Dad, you guys home? Naomi called out. In the dining room, sweetheart. Maya Carter, 22 years old, in her final year of pre-law at Columbia, appeared in the doorway. She looked so much like her mother, the same warm brown eyes, the same high cheekbones, but she had David's height and his stubborn fire. Hey, you're back, she said, dropping a kiss on her father's cheek before sliding into a chair. How was Denver? Did they love your speech? David and Naomi exchanged a look. Your father didn't make it to Denver, Naomi said quietly. Maya's eyes narrowed, her instincts kicking in. What happened? Once again, David recounted the story. As he spoke, he watched Maya's expression shift, from shock to outrage to a cold, controlled anger that reminded him so much of himself. This, Maya said finally, her voice like steel, is exactly why I want to go into civil rights law. David nodded. This is why I keep telling people, Maya continued, that racism isn't over just because we had a black president. Just because their one black friend never mentions experiencing discrimination doesn't mean it's not real. David sighed. People see what they want to see, he said. It's easier to believe the problem doesn't exist than to confront it. So what are you going to do about it? Maya asked, her sharp eyes locked onto him. David's answer was immediate. Everything I can, starting tomorrow. Later that night, after Naomi had fallen asleep, David sat at his desk, typing an email to his deputy director, Henry Lawson. He outlined everything that had happened, what he wanted, a full investigation, a review of TSA screening procedures at all major airports, a statistical analysis of random screenings, broken down by race, gender, and religion. As he typed, his mind drifted to his father, a man who had marched with Dr. King, who had faced fire hoses and police dogs just for the right to be treated as a man who had lived long enough to see his son graduate from Yale Law, but not long enough to see him become the first black director of Homeland Security. I'm still fighting your fight, Dad, David whispered into the empty room. It's just the battleground that's changed. He hit send, closed his laptop, and finally went to bed, knowing that tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new chapter in his lifelong fight for justice. The next morning, David's office his assistant, Elena Navarro, had arranged an emergency meeting with his senior staff after receiving his late-night email. Director Carter, said Henry Lawson, closing the door to the conference room. I've read your email. I'm appalled by what happened. Henry was an old friend, a former Marine who had worked his way up through government agencies before becoming David's right-hand man. He was white, in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a commanding presence that came from years of military service. We all are, added Monica Patel, the department's chief legal counsel. This is completely unacceptable. Around the table, the rest of the senior staff nodded. Thank you, David said. But as I said in my email, this isn't just about what happened to me. It's about a systemic problem that affects thousands of travelers every day. Travelers who don't have the power to demand accountability. What exactly are you proposing? Asked Daniel Cheng, who oversaw transportation security. A complete overhaul of airport screening procedures, David replied. I want data on every random screening conducted at major airports over the last 5 years. I want to know who's being targeted and why. I want to know what criteria TSA agents are using to determine who gets additional scrutiny. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Director, he said carefully, with all due respect, TSA procedures are designed to maximize security. If certain demographic groups are being screened more frequently, there might be intelligence-based reasons for that. David's sharp gaze locked onto him. Are you suggesting, he asked, that there's intelligence indicating that black professionals in suits pose a higher security risk? Daniel flushed. Of course not, he muttered. But we need to be careful not to compromise security in the name of political correctness. David's voice was calm but unwavering. This isn't about political correctness, he said. This is about constitutional rights. Silence. Then Henry spoke. David, he said, you know this is going to ruffle some feathers. David didn't hesitate. Good, he said firmly, because some feathers need ruffling. This isn't just about civil rights, David Carter said, his voice steady but charged with conviction. This is about ensuring that American citizens aren't subjected to different treatment based solely on the color of their skin. He looked around the conference room, where his senior staff sat in tense silence. And let me be absolutely clear. Racial profiling doesn't enhance security. It undermines it. It wastes resources on bias instead of targeting actual threats. The room remained still for a moment. Then, Maya Patel, the department's chief legal counsel, leaned forward. I agree, David, she said. Beyond the obvious ethical issues, there are serious legal vulnerabilities here. If we can prove systemic bias in TSA screening procedures, we're looking at potential class action lawsuits that could cost the government millions. Elena Navarro, David's assistant, rarely spoke in these high-level meetings, but now she couldn't stay silent. Not to mention, she added, this is a public trust issue. How can we ask communities to partner with us on national security when they feel like they're being targeted by the very system that's supposed to protect them? David nodded. Exactly. This isn't just a moral imperative, though it certainly is that. It's also a practical one. Effective security depends on public trust and cooperation. Henry Lawson, his deputy director, was always focused on action. So, where do we start? He asked. David had already thought about this. I want a task force, he said. Maya, you'll lead it. I want representatives from civil rights groups, TSA leadership, intelligence divisions, and I want data analysts who can break down screening patterns. We also need community representatives to speak to the real-world impact of these practices. Maya nodded, already taking notes. Henry spoke up again. What about Officer Coleman and Bradley International? Chief Park has suspended him pending an investigation, David replied. But I don't want this to be about one officer or one airport. I want systemic change. Henry exhaled. The media's gonna get wind of this, he warned. Especially once they find out it happened to you. David met his gaze. I know, he said, and I plan to use that. This is an opportunity to start a national conversation about how we balance security and civil liberties. About who bears the burden of our security practices and whether that burden is equitably distributed. The meeting continued for another hour, with the team hammering out details of the task force and their first investigative steps. By the time they finished, David felt something he hadn't since the day he was detained. A renewed sense of purpose. Yes, what had happened to him was humiliating, infuriating, but if it could serve as a catalyst for real change, then maybe, just maybe, some good could come from it. As the others filed out, Henry lingered behind. You know they're gonna fight you on this, he said once they were alone. Not just TSA, Henry continued. People inside our own department. There are folks who genuinely believe that racial profiling is a necessary evil. David's jaw tightened. Then they're wrong, he said simply, and I'll fight back harder. Henry smiled slightly. I know, that's why I was so damn glad when you were appointed. His smile faded. Just watch your back. Not everyone wants to see a black man succeed in this position, especially one who's willing to rock the boat. David sighed. I've been dealing with that my entire career. He looked out his office window, where the city stretched before him, the Capitol, the Washington Monument, standing tall as symbols of America's ideals and its contradictions. His phone buzzed. A text from Naomi. How are you holding up? David typed back. Better, making plans, going to change things. Her reply came almost instantly. That's my husband, always fighting the good fight. David smiled, put his phone away, and got back to work. The story broke. Homeland Security Director detained in airport profiling incident. The Washington Post ran it above the fold. The New York Times was more measured, but just as damning. Top security official becomes victim of racial profiling at Bradley International. By mid-morning, David's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Journalists, politicians, civil rights leaders, everyone wanted a statement. Elena poked her head into his office. Sir, the President's office is on line 1, and the Attorney General is on line 2. David nodded, exhaling deeply before picking up the phone. Mr. President, President Ellis didn't waste time. "I just read the Post article," he said, his voice grave. "Why the hell didn't you tell me about this immediately?" David kept his tone even. "I wanted to have a plan in place first," he replied. "I didn't want this to be about me. It's about a systemic problem." The president's voice sharpened. "Damn right it is. This is unacceptable. The director of Homeland Security detained like some common criminal? What the hell are they thinking over at TSA?" David stared at his desk, jaw tight. "That's what I intend to find out, sir." "Good," the president said. "You have my full support, whatever resources you need. I want a briefing on your task force by the end of the week." After finishing the call with the president, and a similar one with the attorney general, David finally had a moment to breathe. He turned to Elena, who was sorting through the flood of calls and messages. "What's the public reaction?" he asked. She sighed. "Mixed," she admitted. "Social media is blowing up. A lot of support, especially from Black and brown communities, but also plenty of people saying you overreacted, that you should have just cooperated, that you're playing the race card." David had expected that. "And the conservative media?" Elena grimaced. "Exactly what you'd expect. Fox News is suggesting you're using your position to push a personal vendetta. They're saying this could compromise national security." David laughed dryly. "Because ensuring constitutional rights is somehow at odds with security?" "Apparently," she muttered. She scanned the rest of the messages. "Oh, and Officer Coleman is giving interviews," she added, "claiming he was just following procedure, that you were combative." David felt a flash of anger, but quickly suppressed it. "Get me the security footage from the airport," he said. "I want to see exactly what their cameras recorded." "Already requested it," Elena said. "Should have it by end of the day." David smiled slightly. "What would I do without you? Probably miss a lot of meetings," she teased before heading back to her desk. Left alone, David turned on the news, flipping to a live panel debate. One guest, a civil rights attorney, spoke firmly. "Racial profiling doesn't happen in a vacuum," she said. "It's part of a larger systemic pattern where Black Americans are presumed dangerous until proven otherwise." David watched in silence. This was just the beginning, and he was ready for the fight ahead. David Carter had expected the backlash. The support was overwhelming from minority communities, civil rights groups, and legal experts. But there were also plenty of people claiming he was overreacting, that he should have just cooperated, that he was playing the race card. He had seen it before. And as expected, conservative media had their own spin. Homeland Security Director using his position for a personal vendetta? One commentator questioned on Fox News. Is David Carter compromising national security by pushing a racial agenda? David clenched his jaw, unable to keep the edge from his voice as he muttered, "Because apparently, ensuring constitutional rights and keeping the country safe are at odds with each other?" Elena Navarro, his assistant, gave him a sympathetic look. "There's also a press conference request from the NAACP," she said, flipping through her notes. "And the Congressional Black Caucus wants to meet with you." David nodded. "Set up both. And find me time to meet with grassroots civil rights organizations. Not just the big names. I want the people doing the work on the ground." "Will do," Elena said, scribbling it down. She hesitated before adding, "Oh, and Officer Coleman is giving interviews." David's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Interviews?" Elena sighed. "He's claiming he was just following procedure and that you were combative." A flash of anger surged through David, but he quickly suppressed it. "Get me the security footage from the airport," he said. "I want to see exactly what their cameras recorded." "Already requested it," Elena confirmed. "Should have it by the end of the day." David gave a small, tired smile. "What would I do without you?" "Probably miss a lot of meetings," she quipped, flashing him a grin before heading back to her desk. Left alone, David turned on the small TV in his office. A news panel was dissecting his case. The screen was split 4 ways. A Black civil rights attorney, a white former TSA official, a Latina political analyst, a moderator. "You need to understand," the civil rights attorney was saying, "that racial profiling doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's part of a larger systemic pattern where Black Americans are presumed dangerous until proven otherwise." The former TSA official shook his head. "With all due respect, TSA personnel are trained to look for suspicious behavior, not skin color. If Director Carter was detained, There was probably a reason beyond his race. The civil rights attorney wasn't having it. Oh, such as? The TSA official hesitated. Well, we don't have all the facts yet. But we do have data, the Latina political analyst interjected. She looked down at her notes. Study after study shows that black and brown travelers are subjected to additional screening at rates that far exceed their white counterparts. Director Carter's experience, while shocking given his position, is, unfortunately, common for people of color. David turned off the TV. He had heard enough. The debate was playing out exactly as he'd expected. Those who had experienced profiling understood it instantly. Those who hadn't demanded more facts. His phone buzzed. A text from Caleb, his son. Just saw the news. You okay, Dad? David exhaled slowly before responding. I'm fine. Using this as an opportunity for change. Caleb's response came almost immediately. That's why you're my hero. Give them hell. David smiled. Those 6 words, that simple vote of confidence from his son, fortified him. This wasn't just about him. It was about his children, his future grandchildren, and the countless others who faced the same bias every day. That afternoon, David stood before a row of reporters, giving his first official statement since the incident. He promised a thorough investigation, systemic reforms to address racial profiling, a review board to track TSA screening practices nationwide. Afterward, he met with his task force, now officially named the Civil Rights and Transportation Security Review Board. Finally, as the day wound down, the airport security footage arrived on his desk. David watched every second. It was crystal clear. He had been cooperative. He had remained professional. And Officer Coleman's story was a blatant lie. David was preparing to leave for the day when his secure line rang. It was Chief Park, head of airport security. Director Carter, she said, her voice tense. I wanted to update you personally. Our internal investigation has uncovered some disturbing information about the incident. David sat back down at his desk. Go on, he said. There was a brief pause before she continued. The suspicious person report that led to your screening? Park said. It came from another passenger. David's grip tightened on the phone. A passenger? Yes, sir. A man reported and I'm quoting directly here, black male in a suit acting suspiciously near the security checkpoint. David's chest tightened. He already knew the answer, but he asked anyway. And what was my suspicious behavior exactly? Park hesitated, then sighed. According to the witness statement, you were looking around nervously and checking your watch repeatedly. David closed his eyes briefly. He had been texting Naomi. He had been checking the time because of the weather delays. Yes, sir, Park said. That's clear from the footage. There was nothing suspicious about your behavior whatsoever. David exhaled sharply. And Coleman ran with this vague report without assessing the situation objectively? Yes, sir. I believe that's a fair assessment. David rubbed his temple. Thank you for the update, Chief Park, he said. Please forward all this information to Maya Patel. She's leading the task force investigation on this matter. Understood. After hanging up, David sat in silence for a long moment. A single passenger's bias, amplified by an officer's prejudice, had led to his detention. It was a perfect example of how systemic discrimination functioned. Individual biases, institutional power, a broken system reinforcing itself. As he finally headed home, his mind drifted to his father. He thought about the stories he'd heard growing up. His father being refused service at restaurants, having to use separate water fountains, being called boy, even as a decorated war veteran. The forms of discrimination had evolved, becoming more subtle, more hidden, but the underlying prejudice remained. His father's voice echoed in his mind. The fight is never over, son. Each generation has to fight it in their own way. David was ready for his fight, and this time, he had the power to make real change. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. David testified before Congress, giving a detailed account of his experience. His task force presented preliminary findings, and one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't just about one airport. This wasn't just about one officer. This was a national crisis, and David Carter wasn't going to stop until it was fixed. The security footage from Bradley International had been released to the public with David Carter's permission, and it had gone viral. The video clearly showed the contrast between David's calm, measured demeanor and Officer Coleman's escalating aggression. As more facts emerged, public opinion shifted dramatically. Even some conservative commentators, initially skeptical, began to acknowledge that David had been treated unfairly. Meanwhile, Officer Coleman had gone silent. His media appearances stopped abruptly after the footage completely contradicted his claims that David had been combative. But while the public supported David, the incident had taken a toll on him personally. For the first time in years, he found himself hesitating before stepping into an airport. A tightness formed in his stomach, one that hadn't been there before the incident. Naomi noticed it immediately. She caught him checking and rechecking his government ID before a flight, his fingers tracing the edges as if the small plastic card could somehow protect him. "You know that won't help," she said gently one evening as she watched him slip his ID into an easily accessible pocket for the 5th time. David sighed. "I know," he admitted. "But it makes me feel like I'm doing something." That day, David was preparing for one of the most important meetings yet, a roundtable discussion with civil rights leaders, TSA officials, and community representatives. The goal: to draft new guidelines for airport screening procedures with explicit protections against racial profiling. He was reviewing his notes when a knock sounded at his office door. Henry Lawson entered, his expression troubled. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. David looked up sharply. "What kind of problem?" Henry closed the door behind him. "There's resistance to the new guidelines," he said. "Not just from TSA, which we expected, but from inside our own department." David leaned back in his chair. "Who?" "Daniel Cheng." David's stomach sank. Daniel had been increasingly distant in meetings, often finding excuses to miss task force updates. "On what grounds?" David asked. Henry handed him a memo. David scanned the document quickly. It was carefully worded, but the intent was clear: to undermine the task force's work. The memo suggested that the new guidelines were merely a reactionary response to one isolated incident, rather than addressing long-standing patterns of discrimination. David set the memo down, exhaling slowly. "He's rallying support," David said. Henry nodded grimly. "Trying to force you to back down. Does he have allies?" Henry sighed. "Particularly among the old guard, people who have been resistant to change from day one." David was silent for a moment. Then he straightened. "Thank you for bringing this to me," he said. "I'll handle it." "How?" Henry asked. David met his gaze. "The way I always do, head on." After Henry left, David picked up his phone and called Maya Patel. "I need Daniel Cheng at today's roundtable," he said. Maya hesitated. "He's been dodging these meetings." "Then make it clear this isn't optional," David said. "He's claiming scheduling conflicts," Maya warned. David's voice was firm. "Tell him to resolve those conflicts. This is a direct order from the Director of Homeland Security." By 1:55 p.m., the department's main conference room was filled. Civil rights attorneys, community advocates, TSA representatives, members of David's task force. At exactly 2 p.m., Daniel Cheng walked in, the last to arrive. He looked distinctly uncomfortable. David wasted no time. "We're here for one reason," he said. "To ensure that our security procedures protect all Americans, both their physical safety and their constitutional rights. These goals are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they're interdependent." For the next hour, the group discussed the task force's findings, which confirmed what many had long suspected. Travelers of color were subjected to additional screening at rates that far exceeded their white counterparts, even when controlling for travel patterns and behavior. Maya concluded her presentation. "The data is clear," she said. "This isn't about a few isolated incidents. It's about a pattern of discrimination that has become embedded in our screening protocols." Daniel Cheng finally spoke. "With all due respect," he said, "correlation doesn't imply causation. There could be other factors at play that your analysis doesn't capture." David's voice was neutral. "Such as?" Daniel shifted in his seat. "Travel patterns from countries of concern, behavioral indicators that are statistically more common in certain demographics, intelligence-based screening priorities." Maya leaned forward. "We controlled for all of those factors," she said, "and the disparity remains significant." Dr. Jamila Washington, a civil rights attorney from the ACLU, spoke next. "Let's be clear," she said. "What happened to Director Carter cannot be explained by any of those factors." She turned toward Daniel. He was profiled because he was a black man in a suit, who a passenger found suspicious for simply checking his watch. Daniel looked increasingly uncomfortable. "One incident doesn't prove systemic bias," he muttered. David nodded. "No, it doesn't," he said, surprising him. "But thousands do." He looked directly at Daniel. "We have documentation of thousands of these cases, Mr. Cheng. What happened to me was not exceptional. The only exceptional thing is that it happened to someone with the power to demand accountability." The room fell silent. David let the moment hang. Then he continued. "I understand the concerns about security," he said. "I share them. It is my job to keep this country safe. But I reject the false choice that we must sacrifice civil liberties to do so." His voice hardened. "Because racial profiling doesn't enhance security. It undermines it. It wastes resources on bias instead of focusing on actual threats. It damages public trust in the very institutions that are supposed to protect us all." Daniel said nothing. David took a breath, then spoke again. "I will be implementing these changes," he said, "and I expect full cooperation from everyone in this department." His gaze locked onto Daniel. "That includes you." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, but he nodded slowly. David turned back to the group. "This is just the beginning," he said. "We are fixing the system, for good." And this time, he wasn't backing down. David Carter stood at the front of the roundtable discussion, his voice steady and measured. "We don't have to choose between security and civil liberties," he said. "We can have both. We must have both." He turned his gaze directly to Daniel Cheng. "I've seen the memo you've been circulating, Mr. Cheng," he said, his voice neutral but firm. "I appreciate that you have concerns about the direction of this task force, but rather than undermining our work behind closed doors, I would prefer you bring your concerns to me directly. My door is always open." Daniel's face reddened slightly at the direct confrontation. He cleared his throat. I was simply expressing my professional opinion based on years of experience in transportation security." David nodded once. "And I value that experience," he said, "which is why I want you fully engaged in this process, not working to sabotage it." The room was silent. "The question is," David continued, "are you willing to be part of the solution, or are you committed to defending a system that we now know is fundamentally flawed?" It was a public challenge. Daniel had no choice but to concede, at least temporarily. "I'm committed to national security, Director Carter," he said stiffly. "If you believe these changes will enhance that security, I'll support them." David nodded. "Good," he said, "because I do believe that a system that targets people based on appearance rather than behavior is not only unjust, it's ineffective." He turned to the group. "It misallocates resources and it undermines public trust in the very institutions designed to protect them." The discussion continued for another hour. By the end, they had finalized a framework for new guidelines that would explicitly prohibit racial profiling, enhance behavior-based security measures, implement stricter oversight for TSA screenings. As the meeting wrapped up, David asked Daniel to stay behind. "You didn't have to embarrass me in front of everyone," Daniel muttered, once the room was empty. David tilted his head slightly. "And you didn't have to go behind my back," he countered. "You could have brought your concerns to me directly." "Would it have made a difference?" Daniel challenged. David exhaled slowly. "It would have shown respect for the chain of command," he said. "And yes, it might have made a difference." There was a long pause. Daniel finally looked away. "I've been with this department for 15 years, he said. "I helped develop many of the protocols you're now dismantling." And there it was. This wasn't about security. This was personal. Daniel felt like the reforms were a direct attack on his work, as if admitting flaws in the system meant admitting he had failed. David softened his tone slightly. "This isn't about you, Daniel," he said. "This is about building a better system, one that is more just and more effective." David took a step closer. "I'd like you to be part of that process," he said. "But I need to know I can trust you." Daniel was silent for a long moment. Finally, he sighed. "What do you need from me?" David didn't hesitate. "Your expertise, your experience, but also your willingness to acknowledge that the system you helped build has flaws that need to be addressed." Daniel's expression remained guarded. "And if I can't do that?" David's voice remained steady. "Then maybe this isn't the right department for you anymore." It was a clear message. Get on board, or get out. Daniel nodded slowly, understanding the ultimatum. I'll think about what you've said, he muttered before leaving. David stood in the now empty room, letting out a long breath. He hadn't wanted to issue an ultimatum, but the stakes were too high for half measures. The culture of an organization was set from the top, and he needed his senior staff fully committed. His phone buzzed, a text from Naomi. How did the meeting go? David typed back. Progress. Slow, but steady. Her reply came quickly. That's how all-important change happens, one step at a time. David smiled. She always knew exactly what he needed to hear. He gathered his notes and headed back to his office, ready for the next battle, because that's what this was. Not a single skirmish over one incident at one airport, but a campaign to reshape how America balanced security and civil liberties. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing worth doing ever was. 6 months had passed since the Bradley International incident. David had made significant progress. New screening guidelines had been implemented. Mandatory anti-bias training for TSA officers had begun. A civilian oversight board was now in place to review complaints. Even public opinion had shifted. Polls showed majority support for the new measures. The president had personally called to commend David on the reforms. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, but as David set the last fork down at the dining table, he could sense Naomi's unease. He looked at her. What's wrong? She hesitated. I got another one today. David's jaw tightened. Where? Left on the windshield of my car at the grocery store. His stomach dropped. What did it say? She set her napkin down, her voice calm but firm. The usual, that you're a race baiter, that you're making America less safe, that we should watch our backs. She finally looked up at him, and in her eyes, David saw both anger and fear. It was on my car, David, she whispered. They know where I shop. The threats had started months ago. At first, they were just angry emails and social media posts. Then came letters to their home address. And now, apparently, they were being left on Naomi's car. David reached for his phone. I'm calling Agent Rivera. We need increased security. Naomi placed her hand over his to stop him. That's not going to solve the problem, she said softly. David stared at her. What are you suggesting? He asked. That I stop? His voice hardened. That I back down because some cowards are making threats? Of course not, Naomi snapped. You know me better than that. She took a deep breath, her voice lowering. I'm saying we need to be realistic about what we're facing. This isn't just about policy anymore, she said. It's personal, and it's affecting our family. Before David could respond, the front door opened. Mom? Dad? Maya's voice rang through the house. I brought Caleb. Their children walked into the dining room, laughing and chatting. Caleb, now in his West Point uniform, embraced his father. At 20 years old, he stood as tall as David with the same broad shoulders and quiet confidence. David forced a smile, setting aside his rage for now. Because tonight was a family dinner, and for at least one evening, he wanted to pretend they were just another ordinary family. David Carter met Naomi's gaze across the dinner table, forcing a smile as their son Caleb and daughter Maya chatted about school and work. But Maya, perceptive as always, wasn't fooled. You guys look serious, she said, setting her fork down. David hesitated. Just work stuff, he said, not wanting to worry them. Maya's eyes narrowed. It's the threats, isn't it? She asked. I saw something about it online. Some right-wing forum posting our address. Caleb's posture stiffened instantly, his West Point training kicking in. What? He demanded. Why didn't you tell me? Naomi sighed. Because there's nothing you can do about it, she said firmly. I'm not a child anymore, Mom, Caleb protested. I'm training to protect this country. I should know if my family is being threatened. Your mother's right, David said, his voice calm but firm. There's nothing you can do that isn't already being done. We have security. We're being careful. He glanced between his children. Now let's not let this ruin our dinner, he added. This is supposed to be a celebration. They sat down to eat, but the easy conversation they usually enjoyed wasn't there. Caleb kept pressing for details. Maya started listing similar intimidation tactics used against civil rights leaders throughout history. David finally sighed. It means you're making a difference, Dad, Maya said. If they're this scared, you must be doing something right. That's one way to look at it, Naomi murmured, poking at her food. After dinner, while Caleb and Maya cleared the table, David pulled Naomi aside into the living room. "I need to know where you stand on this," he said quietly. Naomi studied him. "Are you asking me to back down?" David exhaled. "No." She was silent for a long moment before shaking her head. "I would never ask you to compromise your principles," she said. "But I am asking you to recognize the reality of what we're facing. This isn't going to get easier. It's going to get harder, and we need to be prepared for that." David took her hands in his. "I am prepared," he said, "but I need to know that you are too. That we're in this together." Naomi squeezed his hands. "We've been together for everything else," she said. "Why would this be any different?" Their moment was interrupted by the ringing of David's secure phone. Only a handful of people had this number, and they only used it for emergencies. "Carter," he answered. "Sir, it's Chief Park from Bradley International," came the voice on the other end. David felt a chill. "I thought you should know immediately," Park said. "We've had an incident." David's grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of incident?" "A black federal judge was selected for additional screening," Park said. When he identified himself, the screening officer accused him of lying about his identity. David closed his eyes briefly. "Did it escalate?" "Yes, sir," Park said grimly. "He was detained, handcuffed, almost exactly like what happened to you." David opened his eyes, his voice cold. "Who was the screening officer?" Park hesitated. "That's the other thing you need to know, sir," she said. "It was Officer Coleman." David's chest burned. "He was supposed to be suspended pending review." "He was, sir," Park said. "But he was quietly reinstated 3 weeks ago." David stiffened. "I only found out about it myself when this incident occurred," Park added. David's free hand curled into a fist. "Who reinstated him?" "That's not clear yet," Park admitted. "I'm looking into it." David exhaled sharply. "I want a full report on my desk first thing tomorrow," he ordered. "And I want Coleman suspended again, effective immediately." "Already done, sir," Park confirmed. "I've personally apologized to Judge Walker, but I thought you should know right away." David hung up, his mind racing. He turned to see Naomi watching him, her expression etched with concern. "What is it?" she asked. David's jaw tightened. "It's happening again," he said. "Another black official, detained at Bradley International." Naomi's expression hardened. "The same officer?" David nodded. "The one who was supposed to be suspended." Naomi shook her head. "Someone reinstated him without authorization." "I intend to find out who," David said darkly. Just then, Maya and Caleb entered the room, their conversation dying down as they noticed the tension. Maya frowned. "What's going on?" David hesitated. Then he told them. Maya's face flashed with anger. "This is exactly why your work matters, Dad," she said fiercely. "This is why you can't back down, no matter what threats they make." Caleb nodded. "You're fighting for something bigger than all of us." David looked at his wife, his daughter, his son. They were all standing with him, despite the personal cost. He felt a surge of pride and determination. "Yes," he said quietly. "Yes, I am, and I'm going to keep fighting until we see real change." David called an emergency meeting of his senior staff. The incident with Judge Walker had made national news. Many commentators were already drawing parallels to David's own detention. As soon as everyone was seated, David spoke. "I want to know who reinstated Officer Coleman," he said, his voice like steel. "And I want to know why the new screening protocols weren't followed in Judge Walker's case." The room was silent. Staff members avoided eye contact. David's gaze hardened. "No one knows?" he pressed. "This officer was suspended on my direct orders, yet someone had the authority to bring him back. I want to know who that someone was." Finally, Henry cleared his throat. "I believe it may have been Daniel Cheng, sir." All eyes turned to Daniel's empty chair. David narrowed his eyes. "Where is Mr. Cheng?" "He called in sick this morning," Elena supplied. David's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. "Get him on the phone," he ordered. Now, Elena hurried out of the room. David turned back to the group. "If Cheng reinstated Coleman without proper authorization, that's insubordination," he said. "But let's be absolutely clear. This isn't just about one officer or one administrator. This is about a system that continues to resist change, a system that protects its own at the expense of justice." A moment later, Elena returned, her expression grim. "Sir," she said hesitantly, "Cheng isn't answering his phone." David's face was stone cold. "Then we find him," he said. and we shut this down for good. David Carter stood at the head of the table, his expression unreadable as Elena Navarro delivered the update. "He's not sick," she said. Cheng took a personal day. David felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. "Find out where he is," he said, "and get me everything on his communications from the past month. Emails, phone logs, meeting schedules." One of the legal advisors hesitated. "Sir, that might require a formal investigation. We'd need to establish cause." David's voice was steel. "The cause is the unauthorized reinstatement of an officer suspended for racial profiling, who then immediately engaged in the same behavior again," he said. "I'd say that's cause enough." The room fell silent. Maya Patel, head of legal, exhaled sharply. "The new screening protocol should have prevented this exact scenario," she said. "So that means either they're not being followed, or they're being deliberately circumvented." "This could set our work back months," Maya warned. "If people believe the new protocols don't work, they'll use this as ammunition to roll them back." David nodded grimly. "Which," he said, "may have been exactly the point." The meeting was interrupted when Elena hurried back in, a tablet in hand. "Sir, you need to see this," she said. She set the tablet on the table and pressed play. The room fell silent. On the screen, Daniel Cheng stood at a podium, the seal of a conservative think tank behind him. His voice was clear, confident, and full of betrayal. "This is why I can no longer in good conscience remain at the Department of Homeland Security," Cheng declared. David's jaw tightened. "Director Carter's crusade against so-called racial profiling has compromised our security protocols and placed American lives at risk." David's expression remained impassive, but inside, anger burned hot. These new guidelines, implemented after his personal incident, prohibit officers from using their training and instincts to identify potential threats. David clenched his fists beneath the table. Cheng wasn't just leaving, he was actively attacking the reforms. "The incident yesterday with Judge Walker is being twisted to justify even more restrictive measures," Cheng continued. "But what the public isn't being told is that Judge Walker's behavior raised legitimate security concerns. He became combative when questioned, refused to comply with officer instructions, and made threatening statements. These facts are being suppressed to fit a political narrative." David exhaled slowly, his fury controlled but undeniable. "That's a lie," he said quietly. He had seen the security footage. Judge Walker had been completely cooperative. On screen, reporters fired questions at Cheng. "Are you suggesting that Director Carter is using his position to push a personal agenda?" Cheng's expression was measured, his words careful. "I believe Director Carter is sincere in his beliefs," he said. "But I also believe his judgment has been clouded by personal experience. He is seeing racism where it doesn't exist, and imposing solutions that create more problems than they solve." Another reporter jumped in. "And what about Officer Coleman? Reports indicate he was reinstated despite being suspended for his role in Director Carter's detention." For the first time, Cheng hesitated. "Officer Coleman is a dedicated professional with an exemplary record," he said finally. "His suspension was a political decision, not a procedural one. I reviewed his case and determined that he had acted within existing protocols." A third reporter pressed him. "Did you have the authority to reinstate him?" Cheng's jaw tensed. "I acted in accordance with my responsibilities as head of transportation security," he deflected. David had heard enough. He turned off the tablet and looked around the stunned faces of his staff. "Well," he said calmly, "I believe we found our answer about who reinstated Officer Coleman." Henry exhaled sharply. "Cheng just admitted to insubordination," he said, "and now he's resigned before we could fire him." Maya's voice was tight. "It's worse than that," she said. "He's actively undermining our work and giving ammunition to everyone who wants to dismantle these reforms." David nodded. "Yes," he said, "but he's also made a critical mistake." He stood up. "He lied about Judge Walker's behavior," David said, "and we have the security footage to prove it." He turned to Elena. "Schedule a press conference for this afternoon," he said. "It's time to set the record straight." That afternoon, David Carter stood before a sea of reporters, his expression calm but unyielding. Behind him, a large screen was set up, ready to display the security footage. "Good afternoon," David began. I'm here to address the incident that occurred yesterday at Bradley International Airport involving the detention of federal judge Thomas Walker. He took a steady breath. Contrary to statements made earlier today by former DHS official Daniel Cheng, Judge Walker did not engage in any behavior that warranted additional screening or detention. David gestured toward the screen. The footage came to life. Judge Walker was shown being approached by TSA officers, including Officer Coleman. The video clearly showed Judge Walker presenting his identification, Judge Walker remaining calm as the situation escalated, Judge Walker being handcuffed and led away, his face a mask of dignity despite the humiliation. David turned back to the cameras. As you can see, he said, Judge Walker was fully cooperative throughout this encounter. At no point did he become combative or make threatening statements, as Mr. Cheng falsely claimed. He let the footage speak for itself. David paused, letting the weight of it sink in. Then, he continued. Mr. Cheng also claimed that Officer Coleman was reinstated after a review of his case. What he failed to mention was that this reinstatement was done without proper authorization and in direct violation of my orders. The reporters erupted with questions. David held up a hand, silencing them. This is not just about one officer, he said. This is about a system that resists change, a system that protects its own at the expense of justice. Let me be absolutely clear. The reforms we have implemented over the past 6 months are not about politics. They are not about me. They are about ensuring that every American receives equal treatment under the law. He leaned forward slightly. And to those who would resist these changes, who would subvert them from within or attack them from without, I have a simple message. We will not be deterred. We will not back down. We will continue to build a security system that protects all Americans, without bias. A moment of silence passed. Then, a reporter spoke up. Director Carter, what's your next move? David's gaze was steady. He already knew the answer. We move forward, he said, and we finish what we started. David Carter stood at the podium, his voice unwavering. I want to be absolutely clear, he said, his tone steady but charged with controlled anger. The reforms we've implemented over the past 6 months are not about politics. They are not about me. They are about ensuring that every American receives equal treatment under the law. They are about creating security protocols that protect us from actual threats, not imagined ones based on racial stereotypes. He locked eyes with the cameras, his expression firm. And to those who would resist these changes, who would subvert them from within or attack them from without, I have a simple message. We will not be deterred. We will not back down. We will continue to build a security system that protects all Americans, regardless of the color of their skin. The reporters erupted with questions, but David remained calm, authoritative. By the time the press conference ended, the narrative had shifted. Daniel Cheng's credibility was in tatters. Public support for David's reforms had never been stronger. But as David returned to his office, he knew this was just one battle in a much longer war. The forces of resistance were powerful, deeply entrenched, and not easily defeated. The road ahead would be challenging, perhaps even dangerous. Yet as he thought of Naomi, Maya, and Caleb, as he thought of all the families who had faced the same humiliation, the same fear, David knew there was no turning back. This was his fight now, and he would see it through to the end, whatever the cost. Because some causes were worth fighting for, no matter the price. And justice, true, equal justice for all Americans, was the worthiest cause of all. 1 year to the day after David Carter was detained at Bradley International, he stood at a podium in the airport's main terminal, addressing a crowd of journalists, government officials, civil rights leaders, and ordinary travelers. Behind him stood Naomi, Maya, and Caleb, along with his senior staff and the many people who had helped implement what was now known as the Carter Protocols. Even Chief Park was there, having become a crucial ally in the fight for change. David took a breath and spoke. 1 year ago today, he said, I was detained in this very airport, handcuffed, humiliated, solely because of the color of my skin. He paused, scanning the diverse crowd gathered before him. It was an experience that is, unfortunately, familiar to many Black Americans. The only difference was that I was in a position to do something about it. A murmur rippled through the audience. Today, he continued, his voice steady, I am proud to announce that the Carter protocols have been fully implemented at all major airports across the United States. Applause erupted. David gestured toward a large screen behind him, where statistics appeared. 78% reduction in civil rights complaints related to airport screenings. A perfect security record. No breaches, no increased risk. Public trust in transportation security increased by 64% among all demographic groups. The results speak for themselves, David said. The crowd applauded again. But this success didn't come easily, he continued. There was resistance, some of it fierce, some of it underhanded. There were threats against me and my family. There were attempts to sabotage our work from both inside and outside this institution. His gaze swept over the crowd, landing briefly on Daniel Cheng, who stood near the back. Had he come out of curiosity, or was he here out of a desire for redemption? David didn't know, and he didn't care. Because in the end, they had persevered. They had relied on data, not anecdotes, on facts, not fear. And they had proven that security and justice were not mutually exclusive. The system could be reformed without compromising safety. Every American deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. David stepped away from his prepared remarks. He spoke now from the heart. My father was a civil rights activist in the 1960s, he said. He marched with Dr. King. He faced fire hoses and police dogs. He was beaten and arrested for demanding the simple dignity of being treated as a full citizen of this country. David's voice grew softer, more intimate. Before he died, my father told me something I've never forgotten. He said, "The arc of history bends toward justice, but only if good people pull it in that direction." David paused, letting the words settle. Today, I believe we've all pulled that arc a little closer to justice. Not just for me, not just for Judge Walker, but for every traveler who passes through these terminals. He looked back at his family, drawing strength from their presence. This work isn't finished, he said. The Carter protocols are just the beginning. He met the eyes of the crowd. We are expanding these reforms into all aspects of Homeland Security, from border control to intelligence gathering to emergency response. Because every American, no matter what they look like, where they come from, or what they believe, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. The crowd erupted in applause. David let it die down before continuing. Some have called what happened to me a blessing in disguise, an incident that, while painful, allowed for meaningful change. His expression hardened. I reject that framing. Injustice is never a blessing. Discrimination is never a gift. He let the weight of his words settle. What happened to me, what has happened to countless others, was wrong. Full stop. Silence. Then he continued. But what we've done in response, the coalition we've built, the reforms we've implemented, the culture we're changing, that is something to celebrate. His voice rose slightly. That is something we can be proud of. That is America at its best, acknowledging its flaws and working to overcome them. The applause thundered through the airport. David looked out at the travelers moving through the terminal, unaware of the historic moment unfolding before them. This was what he had fought for. As David walked through the terminal with Naomi, Maya, and Caleb, a young black TSA officer approached him, hand extended. Director Carter, the officer said, I just wanted to say thank you. David shook his hand. What's your name? Officer James Wilson, sir. David nodded. Well, Officer Wilson, thank you for your service. It's people like you who will make sure these changes last. As they continued walking, Naomi slipped her hand into his. Your father would be so proud, she said softly. David swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. I think he would be, he whispered, and as he boarded his flight, he knew. The fight wasn't over. It might never be over. But today? Today justice had prevailed. David Carter stood before the gathered crowd, his voice steady, his message clear. As you travel today and in the days to come, he said, know that you are experiencing a security system designed to keep you safe, while respecting your rights. Know that the officers screening you have been trained to see behavior, not bias. And know that if mistakes are made, as they inevitably will be because we are all human, there are now robust mechanisms in place to correct them and prevent them from happening again. He let his words settle over the room. Then, with the same quiet intensity with which he had begun, David said, 1 year ago, I was detained in this airport because of the color of my skin. Today, I stand here not as a victim, but as an agent of change. Not seeking revenge, but pursuing justice. Not dwelling on the wrongs of the past, but building a better future. The applause was thunderous. As David stepped back from the podium, Naomi, Maya, and Caleb were the first to greet him. He embraced them, feeling a deep sense of completion. A circle closed. What had started as a moment of humiliation had become a catalyst for systemic change. There would be more battles ahead, more resistance to overcome. Because the arc of history is long, and the pull toward justice requires constant effort. But today they had moved that arc a little closer to its destination, and that was worth celebrating. The true measure of change. As the crowd began to disperse, David and his family walked through the terminal. A young black TSA officer approached him, his hand extended. "Director Carter," the officer said, his voice full of gratitude, "I just wanted to thank you. The new protocols, the training we've received, it's changed everything. I'm proud of the work I do now. I feel like I'm actually making a difference, not just going through motions or following orders that never made sense to me." David shook the officer's hand warmly. "What's your name?" "Officer James Wilson, sir." David nodded. "Well, Officer Wilson, thank you for your service. It's people like you who will ensure these changes last. Beyond my tenure. Beyond any single administration." As they continued walking, Naomi slipped her hand into his. "Your father would be so proud," she said softly. David's throat tightened. He nodded, swallowing hard. "I think he would be," he whispered. A simple moment, a profound victory. They passed through security, a smooth and respectful process. It bore no resemblance to what David had experienced a year ago. As they made their way toward the gate, David noticed something. A black businessman was being screened ahead of them. The process was efficient, professional, respectful. No extra scrutiny, no suspicion, no humiliation, just standard procedure. The same procedure applied to every traveler. It was a small moment, unremarkable in its normalcy. But for David Carter, it represented everything he had fought for. The right to be ordinary, the right to move through the world without the burden of others' biases, the right to simply be. He squeezed Naomi's hand, overcome with emotion. "We did it," he whispered. She looked at him, her eyes shining with pride and love. "Yes," she replied. "Yes, we did." And as they boarded their flight, husband, father, public servant, changemaker, felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The fight wasn't over. It might never be over. But today, justice had prevailed, and that was enough.